In a Chinese academic setting, it is very common and often expected of speakers to use nouns that encode hierarchical academic relations, such as xuezhang, xuedi, xuejie, xuemei.
学长好，你好。
那我可以开始准备办护照了。
学姐，你什么时候去办护照？
Now, on the surface, it would appear as if in English, you can find nouns that encode the same type of hierarchical academic relations. For example, upperclassmen. I was hanging out with my upperclassmen from high school. Or senior. His seniors were all very respectful. In actual practice, however, if you were to apply terms such as senior and upperclassmen to translation, in literary translation, for example, or subtitling for television shows, it doesn't always work. They simply do not sound natural when used with as high a frequency as in Chinese. Now, why don't they sound natural? That is what I want to explore in this video. I'll be exploring this phenomena from 3 different angles. First, from the angle of noun properties. I want to talk about the difference between individual level properties and stage level properties. I'll also be looking at the difference between relational nouns and entity nouns. I'll next look at cultural differences, where between East and West, there are differing views of hierarchy and there are different school systems that contribute to this difference. And finally, I'll talk about differences in lexical categories, whether these terms can be used as terms of address and whether they can be used as titles. Before we dive in though, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Let's begin with noun properties. Let's look at the sentence, my father called me today. Now let's look at the word father. The word father contains properties that are more or less permanent. If the person is my father, he will remain my father for as long as he exists. There wouldn't be any point where he ceases to be my father. So father is a permanent property. Father is an individual level property. Now contrast that with the sentence, my boyfriend called me today. The word boyfriend has properties that are temporary. We refer to these as stage level properties. The properties of boyfriend hold only for the duration in which I am in a relationship with this person. If I break up with this person, that person is no longer my boyfriend. I can no longer say my boyfriend called me today. I would have to refer to this person in a different way. So father has individual level properties, whereas boyfriend has stage level properties. Some nouns are individual level, other nouns are stage level. Now the question we want to ask here is, are academic relations such as 老师, teacher, 同学, classmate, or 学长, are these relations individual level relations or stage level relations? On the surface, it would appear as if they should be stage level. They should be valid only when I am still in school, right? Once I leave school, once I graduate, then these relations no longer hold. Wouldn't that make sense? And that is how things work in English. So in English, words such as upperclassman or teacher, they are stage level nouns. They are valid only when the speaker is still in school. So if I were to say, my teacher called me today, it triggers an event schema in which the speaker is still in school. If the speaker is not in school, then the facts contradict the schema and the listener gets confused. So let's say I graduated from school 20 years ago, and then I say to somebody, my teacher called me today. The listener is left confused, thinking, do you have a teacher? Are you still in school? And that is because the word teacher, in English at least, is a stage level noun. In Chinese, however, things work differently. The Chinese have a saying, 一日为师,终身为父. A teacher for one day, a father for life. Now, the traditional interpretation of this expression is that you should respect teachers, that they've taught you something important, so that you should treat them like a father for the duration of your life. But I like to interpret this in a different way, from a grammatical angle, which is to say that terms such as teacher, 老师, are stage level nouns that should be interpreted in an individual level manner. That is to say, in Chinese, we treat them not as stage level nouns, but as individual level nouns with properties that are permanent, with properties that outlast your time in school. So whereas in English, if you've already left school, you can't really say he is my teacher. You would have to say he was my teacher. Whereas in Chinese, it's perfectly okay after you've left school to say 他是我的老师. In fact, if you wanted to emphasize that this was in the past, if you wanted to say 他曾经是我的老师, it would sound a bit odd because it sounds like you're trying to downplay the fact that you still see him as a teacher. Which goes to show that academic relations are treated as stage-level nouns in English, but as individual-level nouns in Chinese. The second distinction I want to make is between relational nouns and entity nouns. In Chinese, when you use the terms 学长, 学姐, 学弟, 学妹, you're basically using them as relational nouns. That is, these terms define a relation between the speaker and the referent. They refer to the relative status of the referent relative to the speaker. So for example, when I say something like 我的学长, what I'm saying is that that person I'm referring to is of a higher status, of a higher year than the year that I am in. Okay, this only makes sense if you compare what year he's in versus what year I'm in. Similarly, if I were to say 她是我的学姐, again, this only makes sense if we compare what year I'm in and what year she is in. So 学长 and 学姐 are defined relatively. We're looking at the status of the referent relative to the speaker. Okay, this is a relational use. Whereas in English, when we use the terms senior and upperclassmen, they're more commonly used not as relational nouns, but as entity nouns. That is, they tell us the absolute status of this person, regardless of what year the speaker is in. So when I say something like he is a senior at Lincoln High, what I'm saying is that he is in his final year at Lincoln High. It has nothing to do with what year I'm in. Similarly, she was an upperclassman in college. Okay, what that means is she was in the 3rd or 4th year of college. Again, it has nothing to do with what year I am in. So in English, these terms tend to be used as entity nouns rather than relational nouns. Now, that's not to say that senior and upperclassmen cannot be used in a relational way in English. You do get instances of this, but they're very rare. So in the corpus of contemporary American English, you find sentences like, my seniors were all very respectful, or I was hanging out with my underclassmen from high school. And here, when you see the use of my seniors and my underclassmen, you can see that these terms are used in a relational rather than in an entity manner. Okay, this is possible, but they're very rare. So what this is telling us is that when we use the word senior and upperclassmen, underclassmen in English, for the most part, they're used as entity nouns and rarely only as relational nouns. Which brings us to our second conclusion, and that is nouns that encode academic relations are used mostly as relational nouns in Chinese, but as entity nouns in English. I mentioned earlier that relational uses of academic status terms are rare in English. Now, why are they rare? A lot of this has to do with differing views of hierarchy between East and West. In the East, in the Confucian system, hierarchy is seen as something very important. So the Chinese talk about 长幼有序, old and young each have their place. In the Analects, Confucius says, 君君, 臣臣, 父父, 子子. Okay, a king should act like a king, a subject like a subject. A father should act like a father, and a son like a son. So every person should act according to his place and status, basically. Hierarchy is important. And because hierarchy is important, it's built into the language. It's built into all of these relational nouns. And we'll see later that it's also built into terms of address. It's built into titles. It's even built into kinship terms. So for example, when we talk about brothers and sisters in Chinese, it's necessary to specify whether it's an older brother or a younger brother, an older sister or a younger sister. You don't really have an age-neutral term for these. Whereas in the West, where the focus is more on individualism, hierarchy is seen as less important. Some would even see it as objectionable. It's not built into the language, so academic hierarchy does not need to be incorporated into relational nouns, which we already covered, and later on we'll see that these hierarchies are not encoded in terms of address, neither are they encoded in titles. Another cultural difference I want to point out is the difference in school systems. Now, I want to use the example of 同学, which is often translated as classmate, to illustrate this point. Now, earlier we talked about a distinction along the temporal dimension. That is to say, in English, you can say, he is my classmate only when you're still in school, because it triggers an event schema of the speaker being in school. If you're no longer in school, you have to say, he was my classmate. Whereas in Chinese, you could say, 他是我的同学, regardless of whether you are still in school. So that is one distinction between 同学 and classmate. But that's not what I want to talk about here. What I want to focus on here is the difference in the school system. Now, in English, you can refer to a 同学 as a classmate. He was my classmate. That is okay, but I don't think that's the most common way to refer to somebody with that kind of relation to you. A more common way to refer to a person like this would be a friend from high school, maybe, or a guy I knew from college. Okay, classmate isn't used as often. Why not? This has to do with how schools in the US are organized. Now, the Chinese secondary ed system is based on a homeroom system. That is, students stay in the same room, stay in the same class for the entirety of their middle school or high school career. So 同学 is a significant multi-year relationship. You remain 同学 with this person from the point you start high school all the way until you graduate high school. So 同学 is an important relationship. Whereas in a lot of American schools, these schools operate on a platoon system. Students move from class to class. They have different classes with different people. So being in the same class with somebody is something more temporary. It's not as significant a relationship as, say, being in the same school. So you would tend to say, I went to school with that person, rather than that person was my classmate. With 同学 in Chinese, you also see the phenomenon of concept creep. That is to say, the meaning of 同学 seems to be broadening to include not only your classmates, but students in general. So let's say you're a teacher or a school administrator. It is perfectly common for you to address your class beginning with 同学们 or 各位同学. Now, you, the teacher, are not a classmate of your students, so your relationship is not 同学. And yet, it is possible for a teacher or a principal to address the students as 同学. And that's what we mean by broadening. That's what we mean by concept creep. You see the same kind of creep happening with the term 老师. 老师 used to refer to somebody who is teaching a class in school, a school instructor, so to speak. But nowadays, anybody with any kind of specialization is a 老师. You can pretty much refer to anybody as 老师out of respect. It's going from a professional title to an honorific. When it comes to Chinese terms such as 老师, 同学, 学长, you'll also find that they can be used as direct terms of address in Chinese. 同学,我有事找你. Whereas in English, they cannot. You can't really say, classmate, come here. Terms such as 老师, 同学, 学长 can also be used as titles. For example, 张同学, 小轩同学. Whereas in English, you can't really say classmate Fred or classmate Jane. In some instances, you might be able to say something like teacher Mike, although that only works for children who are very young, like in a nursery or preschool. In all other instances, classmate, teacher, these are not titles generally. So what are we to do then when we're tasked with translating terms such as 学长 or 学姐 from Chinese into English? The answer, it would seem, depends on the context. In situations where the hierarchy is not that important, you can downplay the relationship, leave it out even, as in this clip from the television drama Love Scenery. Here we have an exchange of general pleasantries, and 学姐 is used as a neutral term of address. We can simply leave this term out of the translation.
我刚才学得还挺快的吧？
挺快的，真厉害。
是学姐厉害，学姐教得好。
Whereas in situations where the hierarchy is important, it might be necessary to coin a new term. I've seen terms such as senior brother or junior sister used for this purpose. It might not sound very natural, but sometimes it's necessary, as you can see from this scene, where the younger guy tries to seduce the older woman by calling her name in an intimate way, and the woman tries to rebuff his advances by evoking the hierarchy of 学姐. So she's like, don't call me by my name, call me 学姐.
到了。
梁晨，
没大没小的。
梁晨，
叫学姐。
梁晨，
叫学姐。
晨晨。
那还是叫梁晨。
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.